Thank you very much. I made some shortcut of my paper, which is too long in the morning. I hope that I'll do it in an acceptable time. Otherwise, please interrupt me. The topic is moral supervenience. Given that a scientific approach calls for repeatable experimental evidence, formal language, and strictly impartial findings, moral reasoning and moral knowledge easily become suspicious. In recent decades, the relating critics in particular referred to moral properties like being courageous, benevolent, or dishonest. Such properties have been labeled queer insofar as they resist reduction to natural properties. Accordingly, strong accounts of moral realism which acknowledge moral properties or values as independently existing entities have been denied because such an ontological commitment goes beyond the proper field of scientific explanation. Moral properties are incompatible with the scientific approach if, on grounds of their allegedly separate, non-natural existence, they are causally inefficient or inert. In this case, they are unable to play any explanatory role in scientific contexts and, in addition, elude scientific explanation on their part. The notion of supervenience raised high hopes in terms of accommodating moral reasoning to nowadays scientific requirements. Supervenience is meant to withhold a reductionist picture of moral properties, thereby doing justice to our everyday moral experience. Nonetheless, it is bound to an at least weak form of naturalism. It allows for rational inquiries that match with the underlying scientific worldview. Covering these demands, the notion of supervenience seems to be philosophically attractive and resourceful. Instead of fostering strong reductionism programs, it requires to specify relations of dependence. In the present context, I shall be exclusively concerned with two specific conceptions of dependency relations. On the one hand, I shall take up the notion of foundation, elaborated in Edmund Husserl's logical investigations, which is part of his theory of reason and consciousness. On the other hand, I'm interested in how the notion of supervenience is incorporated into Robert Audi's ethical intuitionism. My aim is to fathom the idea of what it means to talk about moral actions as complex phenomena in terms of involving either different kinds of properties or different layers of intentional constitution. My interest is to first indicate some internal difficulties of Audi's integration of supervenience in his ethical theory. And good luck, Bob is here, so he can straighten me out if there are some misconceptions and failures. And secondly, to draw on phenomenological resources relating to Husserl's mereological foundation in order to better understand the problems that come in the wake of making use of supervenience in the field of morality. I shall focus on the following questions. How does Audi introduce the notion of supervenience? How does Husserl define the notion of mereological foundation? How should we explain the relating types of determination? And can supervenience and mereological foundation rightly be characterized as responding to organic or holistic structures? How can we make sense of the intuitively and reflectively plausible idea that, quote, emotion, like perception and intuition, is often a response to a pattern, and it may be quite rational in the light of that pattern. Perhaps in such cases, emotion often responds to the whole as more than the sum of the parts. Is it possible to work around this idea within a theoretical framework that includes a current account of supervenience. I shall argue that the notion of supervenience, when considered in the light of the overall interests of different branches of ethical intuitionism, turns out to be less appealing and more problematic than it initially appears. Usually, moral supervenience is thought to cover discussion on how a variety of ontologically problematic moral properties meets with a variety of natural properties that are taken for granted. That is, that do not seem problematic from an ontological or epistemological point of view. I shall argue that thinking about Husserl's conception of mereological foundation, we have good reasons to challenge this view. Husserl's conception of foundation offers a rational reconstruction of human experiences of all sorts in terms of analyzing their intentional structure with a view to relations of ontic dependence between those contents that build up the experiences at issue. One aspect according to which relations of dependence can be classified is whether these relations hold in a one-sided or mutual mode. One-sided dependence, which seems to approach the notion of supervenience, can be specified as follows. Whenever an element A is one-sidedly founded in B, it is a dependent content with regard to B. Or in Husserl's words, a content A is non-independent relatively to a content B if there is a law rooted in the generic essences AB, which lays down a priori that the content of the pure genus A can only exist in or associated with the content of the genus B. In the present context, we should be interested in one paradigmatic instantiation of a founding relation that is of central concern to Husserl's analysis of intentional acts. The thesis at issue, which Husserl ascribes to his former teacher Franz Brentano, reads as follows. Each intentional experience is either itself a presentation or is based upon a presentation. Instead of presentation, we may also say representational content or intentional matter. With a view to moral properties, relevant realizations of mereological foundation, among others, occur on occasion of undergoing evaluative experiences. Each evaluative intentional act stands in need of a representational content in order to have a determinate cognitive content. Here's an example. I have to skip this one. A joy may be built on the assertion of a state of affairs, a joy in that state of affairs. The joy is not a concrete act in its own right, and the judgment an act set up beside it. The judgment rather underlies the joy, fixes its content, realizes its abstract possibility for, without some such foundation, there could be no joy at all. Accordingly, moral experiences like, for instance, feeling guilty or acting in an unfair way and thereby harming others equally stand in need of foundation in terms of representational contents. Without this foundation, there could be no feeling of guilt and no unfair or unduly harming actions. This may be considered as an intuition-based and rationally explicable phenomenological variant of W.D. Ross and Robert Audi's thesis that moral properties are consequential on natural properties. The above-mentioned Brentano thesis, each intentional relation is either itself a presentation or is based on such a presentation, can be conceived as roughly analogous to the assumption that lies beneath statements that express relations of supervenience. In order to be ontologically respectable, a property either must be a natural property or must be based on a natural property. According to Audi, moral properties are not identical with non-moral properties, nor can they be reduced to non-moral properties. Moral properties, nevertheless, are consequential on natural properties. They are constitutively anchored in natural properties. Talking like this is meant to bring together two seemingly contrary, though not incompatible characteristics, namely that moral properties have their feet firmly planted in the natural world and still rise above it. This is a quote from Bob. Audi's conception of the anchoring view holds a determinate ontological dependence of moral properties. Following the anchoring view, we should argue that moral properties supervene on natural properties. Here's another quote. First, no two things, whether acts or persons, can share all their natural properties and differ in their moral ones if they have any. And second, any entity having moral properties possesses those properties in virtue of its natural properties or certain of them, where in virtue of expresses an asymmetric relation of dependence and is usually held to imply an explanatory connection as well, such that a thing's possession of a moral property is explainable, at least in part, by appeal to its possession of one or more of the natural properties on which the moral property supervenes. Audi distinguishes general supervenience between moral and natural properties and particular supervenience between an individual things or actions having a certain moral property, for instance, lying and deceiving, and it's having a certain natural property, for instance, committing a breach of contract in a business transaction. According to the above explanation of supervenience, it is impossible for two actions to differ in respect of rightness without likewise differing with regard to some natural property. Supervenience includes a demand for generalization. If it is true that a given thing is good in which you have some of those natural properties it exhibits, it must also be true that every qualitatively indistinguishable thing is good. The relation between natural properties and moral properties is of an a priori stamp. The grounding relation holds from a priori and necessary reasons. As far as the debate on naturalism is concerned, the anchoring view steers for a middle path. On the one hand, it is said that the supervenience view leaves open the ontologically reducibility of moral properties to natural ones, whether to the natural properties in the base or more likely others. And because it grounds moral properties in natural ones, one might be inclined to call it a weak form of naturalism. Though the overall discussion of supervenience in the present theory, of course, is much more complicated, I shall pick out only one aspect which, in my view, clearly shows how the idea of supervenience burdens our work in normative ethics with the background assumptions of the ethics as science view. I shall explain the consequences thereof with reference to Audi's demand that a theory of normative ethics should be epistemically complete. Before doing so, we should once again throw a glance at Husserl's considerations in order to summarize the outcome of his mereological foundation thesis with regard to our present concern. As indicated above, higher order intentional acts like, for instance, aesthetic or moral experiences involve a representational content. It is near at hand to consider this representational content as the factual or descriptive content that is equivalent to the so-called base or subvenient properties of the supervenience model. However, in case of Husserl's mereological foundation, the factual content shows two peculiar features that sharply contrast with the equivalent natural properties according to the supervenience model. First, whenever higher order complexities, for instance, evaluative experiences, are realized, there is, by necessity, a factual content involved which functions as a dependent part whose existence depends on the existence of the relating whole. Secondly, it is indispensable to distinguish two different notions of representation that come into play in Husserl's intentional analysis. On the one hand, there is the factual content that functions as dependent part. On the other hand, there are lower level, full-fledged intentional acts that do not involve any positive or negative assessment, but instead simply represent some object or state of affairs. These intentional acts, which may be designated as purely fact-stating, occur as mere representations, Vorstellungen, or judgments. The upshot of distinguishing these two notions of representation is that what representation means depends on the respective whole we are talking about. How could these elaborations be illuminating with a view to the supervenience debate? The basic assumption of this debate is that moral properties could be demystified and integrated in a scientifically respectable ontology by considering them as consequential on natural properties. As soon as we challenge this ethics as science view in favor of asking for the immanent rationality of consciousness or of moral experiences in particular, it may turn out that moral properties or moral phenomena do manifest themselves in sets of natural properties, yet thereby alter the natural character of their base properties. If this indeed is a promising move, it will become doubtful whether there is a supervenience relation between moral properties and natural properties that could be described in terms of the anchoring view, if this presupposes that we're dealing with neatly distinguishable types of properties. According to a mereological foundation view, it is the peculiar overall character of the whole that, in case of such complex higher order intentional units like moral experiences, determines the function or meaning of its dependent parts. Instead of anchoring moral properties in natural properties, this phenomenological approach proceeds the other way around. It describes the interlacement or penetration of intentional contents and, in particular, the holistic or organic integration of lower-level moments within higher-level unities. Thirdly, if it does make sense to utilize the interlacing view with regard to moral phenomena and to conceive of the relevant factual moments as dependent parts, then these factual contents clearly cannot be identified with natural properties as referred to by scientific theories. On this condition, the task for advocates of moral realism is not to ontologically upgrade moral properties by showing how they can contribute to scientific explanations in virtue of their relation to natural properties. The urgent task, rather, is to work out appropriately fine-grained descriptive tools by means of which we might be able to grasp the specific complexity or organicity of moral phenomena according to their own internal rational structure. In order to see more clearly the practical impact of the difference between the anchoring view and the interlacing view, we may raise the following question. How is it possible to identify the relevant natural properties that function as a supervening base for some given moral property. The problem concerning natural facts is part of the original definition of supervenience, which is clear from this citation. That there is a special non-reductive relation between moral and natural properties such that A, no two things, including actions, can have the same natural properties and differ in their moral ones, and B, certain of the natural properties of a thing determine what moral properties it has, if any. Thus, the injustice of a tyrant, a moral property, might supervene on this brutality toward the people. End of quote. Given that we cannot assume that it is the total sum of all natural properties of a thing that is conceptually constitutive of its moral character or status, we are faced with the problem of how to reliably select the morally relevant non-moral properties and thereby make sure, on pain of circularity, that in doing so we do not already have recourse to moral qualifications of the thing at issue. Yet if it is true that it is our moral theory that helps us to identify the relevant facts, while acknowledgement of these facts is said to justify our knowledge of final duties, then this seems to represent a circular mode of reasoning. What should we take from this? Is it the case that ultimately we must concede that the sharp distinction between natural and moral properties with which we started our considerations blurs in a systematic way? And this being so, do we then not have to state that the conception of moral supervenience found us at least with regard to the determination of final duties? Should we consequently assume that from this practical point of view, moral realists would do better to take seriously the debate on thick concepts instead of focusing on the idea of moral supervenience? At least it seems that following the project of applying the idea of supervenience in the field of morality, we inevitably run into a debate on thick concepts. Suppose that these concerns are well motivated. How then should we go ahead with or respond to a moral epistemology and moral ontology which revolves around the widely accepted notion of supervenience? I take it that at least part of an answer can be acquired by taking into account the conception of mereological foundation. Whenever we state a clear-cut discernibility of natural properties and moral properties, we should realize that we do not refer to natural properties that could occur as part of our everyday experience. Instead, talking like this, we tacitly refer to natural properties from a theoretical point of view or a scientific point of view. It is within a specific theoretical framework that we rationally reconstruct our everyday moral experience by introducing the notion of supervenience, which presupposes a clear-cut distinction between natural properties and moral properties. Right, I try to be shorter. What does that mean in terms of the above-mentioned demand for epistemic completeness? On condition that moral properties are consequential on natural properties, we should endeavor to figure out specific moral duties as they make themselves felt in concrete situations by ascertaining the underlying facts. Endorsing the anchoring view therefore means, quote, that knowledge of specific duties arise ultimately from knowledge of the facts that ground them, end of quote. Hence, we might gain complete knowledge of our moral obligations if we succeed in gaining complete knowledge of the relevant facts. This demand for epistemic completeness, which is understood as an ideal condition, is introduced in Audi's The Good and the Right as follows. Let us call a moral theory epistemically complete, provided it enables us, at least in principle, to determine from non-normative facts about our situation, facts that it may help us identify, what we ought overall to do. Epistemic completeness is a kind of adequacy, or at least desideratum, in a moral theory that enables it to take us from facts of human life, that we have friends, that killing and deceit are rampant, that children are dying, to what we ought to do. The more readily a moral theory enables us to do this, the better it is, other things equal. This notion of epistemic completeness is crucial given that Audi does not only refer to abstract moral principles called prima facie duties, but is interested in how to apply and specify these principles according to the requirements of multiply varying situations. So, the problem is that we have to ask ourselves whether it is possible to say in non-normative factual terms what it is to promise or for someone to be injured or to need help and so on. The present task of ascertaining the factual ground of our moral obligations includes identifying those facts that call for moral decision or moral action in the first place. Therefore, it does not come as a surprise that in this connection, Audi calls to mind that, sorry, this was too quick. There's no quote. That Ross, steeped as he was in Aristotle, took it that without begging any questions, we may assume that both virtue concepts and such concepts as those of injury, lying, and malice, which have been called thick moral concepts, may be presupposed by mature moral agents. End of quote. So, such facts we are talking about here certainly are represented by enriched or thick concepts that are embedded in a contingent variety of socially shareable normative interpretations of what it means to live a human life. Undoubtedly, these are facts of a very special sort, and the crucial question first is whether their thickiness can be drained off in such a manner that one could claim to dispose of purely fact-based definitions of the respective states of affairs. And secondly, the question is whether, as advocates of a moderate ethical intuitionism, we could really want to strive for such purely fact-based definitions. Right, to sum up, only a few sentences more. It seems as if we should say that moral supervenience on a purely abstract level of reasoning presents itself as extremely plausible and indeed hard to deny because it delivers a convincing picture of how moral facts are part of our world. Yet, as soon as we question the conception of fact lying beneath when referring to moral supervenience, things radically change. Given that an intuitionist ethics is interested in making headway with regard to the problems of application and specification on the one hand, and in taking seriously and descriptively approaching the intricate ways of folk morality on the other hand, it must be suspicious of the idea of moral supervenience. Thank you very much.
I want to thank you very much for reading my work with such care and making a fruitful comparison with Husserl. When we talked about Husserl, I got the impression that his main concern in what he cited was with the content of intentional attitudes. If that's right, I couldn't really see any conflict between his view and mine. A second point has to do with the idea of epistemic completeness, which is should give us a way of figuring out from facts about the world what we ought or ought not to do so that we get objectivity, communicability, and so on. I don't think you needed to deny that I had resources for picking out the right base properties or relevant facts, but I don't want to make it sound easy. As to what you call the immanent rationality of moral experience, you didn't give us an example of that. But I think if you did, it's possible we could come to some agreement about how to understand it. I may not be right.
Thank you very much. What I tried with regard to Husserl is to juxtapose two different ideas of how different layers of constitution on the one hand, this is Husserl, and different kinds of properties on the other hand, this is your approach, are elaborated. How does it work that these two different layers or different types of properties form up a unity? How does it work? And I think the advantage of Husserl's approach is, and this is the reason why I called it interlacement or interpenetrating view, that it makes clear that as soon as we have built up a unity, the subvening, the so-called subvening base is transformed according to the requirements of the whole issue. So I think this is a different picture of how to form a unity, because if we take the supervenience account, we should say there at least are two different types of properties. And the fact that the moral properties come into the picture does not alter the subvening base.
In the abstract, I understand you, but can you give us an example of the base being transformed from above as you were representing Husserl's view as implying?
Of course, Husserl is referring to intentional relations. So he would say that this is a formal analysis of different types of parts. There are dependent parts and independent parts, and dependent parts have this characteristic of, so to say, adapting to the overall character of the entire act that results. So, for instance, one and the same cognitive content does not have the same meaning dependent on whether it is part of a fantasy or imaginative act or a perception or whatever.
I can see that, but I believe you're talking at the conceptual and semantic level and referring mainly to the constituents of judgment, where I might be able to agree with Husserl. A theory about that might be compatible with a view on which the properties that are referred to in the judgment are consequential properties.
Yeah.
So I'm not yet sure we really have conflicting views rather than complementary views, one operating more at the semantic intentional level and the other operating more at the ontic and epistemological level.
Yeah, that's right. I'll have to find out. But what really bothers me is to ask, what does it mean to refer to natural properties in the field of meta-ethics, this kind of meta-ethics analysis that supervenience refers to? Because the so-called natural facts, you yourself mention, the facts of human life. I think it's absolutely clear that these are facts of a quite different kind than the facts of a purely scientific approach.
Yes, you're thinking of thick moral properties on which I've done a little more analysis since the materials referred to. I better stop though.
Could you please think of those as rules of species cooperation that are transferred both to moral properties. This is a suggestion. If you think of those as rules of species cooperation that are inherited both genetically and then taught, that would, because what I understand we are objecting to is the positing of natural properties. But if you think of that natural reaction, I would call them reactions, as rules of species cooperation that are both genetically transmitted and taught, mostly taught, obviously. And this way, they can be altered in the sense that if you have a moral experience that shakes your system, then definitely the base will be transformed. For instance, a traumatic experience that changes your value system.
I did not think about such genetic perspectives, but I think the problem of the natural properties in ethical, with regard to ethical questions, is the context dependence of the meaning of the so-called natural properties.
As human, you have a biological basis.
Yeah.
And those, I do believe that you do have moral reactions. I mean, there was a yesterday's paper that showed that children could actually find out what the intentions were. And they are then shaped by upbringing.
Yeah.
But even those, I mean, because I do agree that there is a problem with positing natural properties and it's quite unnecessary. But only as soon as you understand this is a biological point of view that the human's nature is making culture. So morals are ways of orienting ourselves in the environment as a species.
I see.
Adapted.
Of course, I do not think that ethicists should deny that there is a biological basis for all these abilities and actions and so on we find in this field, of course. But I do not think that it suffices to talk about biological foundations, because the crucial ability with regard to morality of human beings, in my view, is the ability to reflect and to change one's own equipment, so to say, to develop according to rational insight. And this does not mean to deny that there is maybe a strong biological foundation. It's just to say that sticking to biology does not help us
I think it's crucial is the analysis of rationality.
Yeah. But I agree, but I don't think that biology could give us a sufficient and informative analysis of rationality as regard to ethics.
No, but we have to.
We have to consider it. Yeah,
not
of course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.